The ice didn't crawl. It claimed. It started at the corners of the window pane in the small third-floor apartment, weaving intricate, jagged patterns that looked like frozen lace. Inside, the air had turned into something sharp and heavy. Every breath 8-year-old Toby took felt like a tiny needle pricking the back of his throat. He sat on the edge of the sagging mattress in the bedroom he shared with his 5-year-old sister, Lily. He wasn't looking at the ice, though. He was looking at the clock on the wall. The second hand ticked with a loud, metallic thunk that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. It was 4 a.m. Their mother should have been home 3 hours ago. She worked the late shift at the industrial laundry across the river, a place of steam and heavy machinery that always left her smelling like bleach and tired dreams. Usually she would burst through the door by 1:15 a.m., bringing with her the smell of the night air and perhaps a half-eaten sandwich she'd saved from her break. But tonight, the great frost had descended. The city's power grid was groaning under the weight of a record-breaking blizzard, and the old radiators in their building had given a final, dying hiss around midnight before turning stone cold. "Toby?" A small, muffled voice whispered from under a mountain of blankets. Toby turned, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here, Lil. Go back to sleep." Lily poked her head out. Her nose was pink, and her breath formed a faint white mist in the air. "Is the heater broken again?" "It's just resting," Toby lied. He was good at lying when it came to keeping Lily calm. It was a skill he'd learned early, like knowing which floorboards creaked or how to stretch a single box of macaroni and cheese over 3 days. "The pipes are just a bit chilly. They'll start humming soon." He stood up, his legs stiff from the cold. He was wearing 2 pairs of socks and his thickest hooded sweatshirt. He walked into the kitchen, his footsteps silent on the linoleum. He tried the light switch. Nothing. The power was out. He tried the kitchen tap, hoping for a drop of warm water, but only a dry, hollow rattling sound came from the pipes. They were frozen solid. He looked out the kitchen window. The streetlights were dark. The world outside was a ghostly, monochromatic white. Snow was piled high against the parked cars, turning them into shapeless mounds. There were no sirens, no engines, no sounds of life. Just the wind, a low and hungry howl that shook the window frames. Fear, cold and heavy like a stone, settled in his stomach. He knew their mother wouldn't just stay away. If she wasn't here, it meant the buses had stopped, or the phones were down, or something worse. But he couldn't think about something worse. He had to be the man of the house. That's what she called him. "My little man." He went back to the bedroom. Lily was sitting up now, shivering violently. Her teeth were chattering a rhythmic clicking sound that made Toby's heart race. "I'm hungry, Toby," she whispered. He went to the cupboard. He found a sleeve of saltine crackers and a jar with 2 tablespoons of peanut butter left. He carefully spread the peanut butter on 4 crackers, making sure to get it right to the edges so it felt like more than it was. He brought them to her on a plastic plate. "Picnic in bed," he said, trying to make his voice sound bright. They ate in silence. The only sound the crunch of the crackers. Toby didn't eat. He told her he'd had a big dinner while she was napping. Another lie. His stomach felt like it was folding in on itself, but he watched her eat every crumb. Praying for the glow of headlights that never came by 6 a.m., the temperature inside had dropped even further. Toby realized that the blankets weren't enough. The apartment was a concrete box that was slowly becoming a freezer. He remembered a science video he'd seen at school about how heat rises. He dragged his mattress off his bed and pushed it onto the floor next to Lily's. Then, he went to the closet and pulled out every piece of clothing they owned. He layered their mother's heavy coats over Lily. He found her old winter scarves and wrapped them around Lily's neck. And, "Head, you look like a marshmallow," he teased, his voice cracking slightly. Lily didn't laugh this time. Her eyes were wide and dark. "When is Mama coming?" "Soon," Toby said. He crawled under the pile of coats next to her, trying to use his own body heat to keep her warm. "The snow is just very deep, Lil. It's taking her a long time to walk through the marshmallows." They lay there for hours as the gray morning light filtered through the frosted glass. It was the kind of silence that made you hear things the building settling. The wind scratching at the bricks like a stray cat. Toby realized they couldn't stay. If the sun didn't come out, and if the heat didn't come back, they would just get colder and colder. He thought about the police station 4 blocks away. He'd seen it many times. It was a big brick building with a blue light over the door. They would have a generator. They would have soup. They would have a phone to find Mama. But for blocks in this weather, for a 5-year-old, might as well have been for miles. He looked at Lily. Her lips were starting to take on a faint bluish tint. That was the sign. He remembered that from a first aid poster. He couldn't wait any longer. Waiting was a slow defeat. "'Kay, Lil," he said, sitting up and rubbing his numb hands together. "Change of plans. We're going to the Blue House." "The police?" she asked, her voice small. "They have the best hot chocolate in the city." Toby lied again, the biggest lie of the night. "But we have to be very fast and very brave." "Can you be brave?" Lily nodded slowly, reaching out to grab the hem of his sweatshirt. "I'll be brave if you hold my hand." Toby stood up, his joints aching. He began the long process of bundling them up for the trek. He didn't know that once they stepped out that door, the city would be unrecognizable. He didn't know that the journey would be the hardest thing he'd ever do. He only knew that the hearth was broken, the house was a tomb, and the only way to survive was to move. The heavy wooden door of the apartment building groaned as Toby pushed it open. He had to use his whole weight, leaning his shoulder into the wood, because the snow had drifted up against the entrance, forming a white barricade. When the gap finally opened, the wind didn't just blow in, it slapped them. It was a physical force, a wall of crystalline air that stole the breath right out of their lungs. Lily pulled back for a second, her small hand tightening so hard on Toby's mitten that he could feel her knuckles through the wool. "Close your eyes a little bit, Lil," Toby shouted over the whistle of the wind. "Just look at my boots. Just follow my feet." They stepped out, and immediately they were waist deep. For Toby, it was manageable. But for Lily, it was like wading through a river of powdered sugar. The world was unrecognizable. The street they walked every day to go to the grocery store or the park had vanished. There were no sidewalks, no curbs, and no black asphalt. Everything was a rolling sea of white. The silence was the scariest part. Usually this city hummed with the sound of tires on wet pavement, the distant rumble of the subway, and the chatter of people on their way to work. Now it was like the world had been wrapped in cotton wool. Toby took the first step, lifting his knee high to clear the drift. They moved like a slow-motion dance, a rhythmic taganbul. Every 10 feet felt like a mile. Toby's mind was racing. He kept counting the landmarks in his head. First, the red mailbox on the corner. Then, the bakery with the faded yellow sign. After that, the big oak tree that sat in front of the library. If he could see those, he knew they were on the right path, but the snow was falling so thick now that he couldn't see the corner, let alone the mailbox. The air was a blurry haze of white and gray. He felt a pang of regret. Maybe they should have stayed in the apartment. At least there, they were dry. Here the snow was already beginning to melt against the warmth of their necks before freezing into icy crusts on their collars. "Toby, my foot is stuck," Lily cried out. He spun around. She had stepped into a holper, perhaps a sewer grate or a deep dip in the pavement hidden by the powder. Her left leg was buried up to the hip. Toby knelt down, his own knees sinking into the freezing slush. He began to dig with his hands. He didn't have a shovel, just his fingers covered in cheap, damp mittens. He scooped away the heavy snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Don't cry," he pleaded, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or himself. "If you cry, the tears will freeze your face. We have to be tough, remember? Like the explorers in that book." Managed to grab her under the arms and heave. With a wet schloop sound, her leg came free, but her boot stayed behind, swallowed by the gray depths of the hole. Toby felt a surge of cold panic that had nothing to do with the weather. A missing boot in this temperature was a death sentence. He plunged his arm into the hole, reaching down until his shoulder was buried. His hand brushed against something cold and rubbery. He gripped it and pulled. The boot came up, filled with icy slush. He didn't waste time. He pulled Lily over to a doorway of a closed-up dry cleaner. He sat her down on the one small patch of concrete that the wind had swept clear. He pulled off her wet sock. Her skin was already a frightening shade of waxy white, and he tucked her bare foot inside his own sweatshirt, pressing it against his stomach. Toby, it's cold. She wailed, her voice thin and high. I know. I've got you, he whispered. He held her foot against his skin until he couldn't feel his own stomach anymore, until his warmth had transferred to her. Then he dumped the snow out of her boot, wiped the inside with the dry part of his sleeve, and forced it back onto her foot. He took off his own extra scarf and wrapped it 3 times around her boot and ankle. Tying it tight so the shoe couldn't fall off again, they stood up and kept going. The wind seemed to be getting angrier. It whipped around the corners of the buildings, creating miniature tornadoes of ice. Toby's glasses, which he usually wore for school, were useless, fogged and iced over, so he shoved them into his pocket, making the world a blurry smear of shadows. He thought he saw a light up ahead, a faint, flickering amber glow. Lou, someone is there. He found a new burst of energy, dragging her toward the light. He imagined a shopkeeper with a thermos of tea, or a neighbor with a working fireplace. But as they got closer, his heart sank. It wasn't a building at all. It was a trash can fire, huddled in the recessed entrance of an old abandoned theater. The grand marquee above it, which once blinked with the names of famous actors, was dark and heavy with icicles that looked like jagged teeth. As they approached the fire, a shadow moved. Toby froze. He pulled Lily behind him, his small chest heaving. Out of the darkness of the theater's entryway, a man stepped forward. He didn't look like the people Toby knew. He was wrapped in layers of tattered blankets and a coat that looked like it was made of 100 different scraps of fabric. His beard was long and matted with bits of frozen mist. He looked like a creature of the winter itself. Toby took a step back, but Lily stumbled. She was too tired to be afraid. She just wanted the heat. She saw the orange flames dancing in the metal drum and made a small whimpering sound. The man stopped. He looked at Toby, then down at the small, shivering girl hidden behind him. His eyes were deep-set and surrounded by 1,000 wrinkles, but they weren't mean. They were just very, very tired. "You're a long way from home, little bird," the man said. His voice was raspy, like stones rubbing together, but it wasn't loud. Toby gripped the strap of his backpack. "We're going to the blue house. To the police. Our mama. She's not home." The man looked down the street, toward the direction Toby was pointing. The path ahead was completely blocked by a fallen power line and a jackknifed delivery truck. The wind was howling through the gap like a banshee. "You won't make the blue house tonight, son," the man said softly. "The big wind is coming back. It's coming back hard." Toby looked at the street, then back at his sister. She was leaning against the cold stone wall of the theater, her eyes half closed. He knew the man was right. He could feel it in the air. The pressure was changing, and the sky was turning an ugly, bruised shade of purple. "Come," the man said, gesturing to the small circle of warmth around the burning trash can. "The fire doesn't care who sits by it." Toby hesitated for a heartbeat. He thought of all the warnings his mom had given him about talking to strangers. But then he looked at Lily's shivering frame and the way her breath was getting shorter. He made a choice. He led her toward the fire. The man, whose name was Elias, moved aside to give them the best spot. He reached into a crate and pulled out a piece of old dry plywood, breaking it over his knee with a loud crack and feeding it to the flames. The fire flared up, casting long, dancing shadows against the boarded-up doors of the theater. For a long time no one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the wood and the roar of the storm outside their little stone sanctuary. Elias reached into a hidden pocket of his many-layered coat and pulled out a small, dented tin. He opened it to reveal a few pieces of hard candy, the kind that tasted like peppermint and dust. He offered one to Lily. She looked at Toby. He nodded slowly. She took the candy. And for the first time in hours, a tiny ghost of a smile appeared on her face. "Thank you, Mr. Winter," she whispered. Elias let out a short, dry chuckle. Mr. Winter, I've been called worse. You did a good thing getting her this far. Not many grown men would have had the heart to keep moving in that. Toby didn't feel like a hero. He felt like he was failing. He felt like he should have been able to get her to the police. He should have been able to find his mom. He sat down on the cold ground, pulling Lily into his lap, and stared into the fire. He watched the orange embers glow and fade, thinking about how small they were in such a big, cold world. He didn't know that miles away, his mother was screaming his name into a phone that wouldn't connect. He didn't know that the city was starting to talk about the 2 missing children. All he knew was the smell of wood smoke, the weight of his sister in his arms, and the strange, quiet presence of the man in the shadows who had given them his heat. The night was just beginning, and the hardest part was yet to come. They were safe for the moment, but the fire was small and the wood was running low. Toby closed his eyes just for a second, listening to the wind and praying for the sun to find them. The fire inside the metal drum was dying. It flickered like a tired heartbeat, casting long, shaky shadows against the brick walls of the theater entryway. Elias, the man the children had found, was staring at the embers with a look of deep worry. He knew how this went. Wood burns fast, and the cold, the real, deep cold, was patient. It just waited for the light to go out so it could move back in. Toby held Lily tighter. She was drifting in and out of a light, uneasy sleep. Her head was resting on Toby's shoulder, and every few minutes her body would give a sharp, sudden jerk as if she were falling. Toby was trying his best to stay awake, but his eyelids felt like they were made of lead. He kept blinking, forcing himself to look at the orange glow, then at the man across from him, then back at the dark street. "We need more wood," Elias said suddenly. His voice was a rasp that cut through the whistling wind. "This won't last another hour, and the wind is shifting. It's going to start blowing the snow directly into this alcove." Toby looked at the street. The snow was coming down so thick now it looked like a solid white wall. "Where can we get wood?" "Everything is buried." Elias looked at the boarded-up doors of the theater behind them. "There's a way inside. A side door that doesn't lock right. It's dangerous because the roof is old and might not hold the weight of the snow, but there are old chairs in there. Wooden ones. If we can get a few of those, we can keep this fire going until the sun comes up." Toby didn't like the idea of going into the dark building. It looked like a giant sleeping monster, but he looked at Lily's pale face and knew they didn't have a choice. "I'll help you," he said. "You stay here. You keep her close to what's left of the heat. You scream as loud as you can. Someone might be out there searching." Elias stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs. He disappeared into the shadows at the side of the building. Toby sat alone with his sister. This was the loneliest he had ever felt. Even in the apartment, there were the sounds of neighbors or the hum of the fridge. Here, there was only the roar of the storm. He started to hum a song his mother used to sing when they were doing the dishes. It was a simple tune, something about a bird finding its way home, Mama. Lily whispered, her eyes fluttering open. "Not yet, Lil," Toby said, his voice soft. "But soon. We're just waiting for the weather to be nice so she can find us." "I'm so thirsty," she said. Toby reached out and grabbed a handful of clean snow from a ledge. He packed it into a small ball and held it out to her. "Eat this. It's like a popsicle without the sugar." She took a small bite, then another. It wasn't much, but it seemed to wake her up a little. Minutes passed. 5, 8, 10. Toby's heart started to pound against his ribs. He looked at the corner where Elias had vanished. He opened his mouth to shout, but then he heard a heavy thud and the sound of dragging. Elias emerged from the darkness, pulling 2 heavy velvet-covered theater chairs. They were old and dusty, but they were made of solid oak. Elias didn't waste time. He smashed the chairs against the concrete step, breaking the legs into manageable pieces. He fed them into the fire. The flames leaped up, turning a bright, angry red. The warmth hit Toby's face like a physical hand, and for a moment, the fear subsided. "Listen to me," Elias said, sitting back down. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving under the layers of rags. "The storm is at its peak. I've lived on these streets a long time, and I've never seen it like this. The radio I had before the batteries gave out said the whole city is shut down. No buses, no cars, nothing. Toby felt the lump in his throat get bigger. Is my mama okay? Elias looked at the boy. He could have lied. He could have said everything was perfect. But he saw the way Toby held his sister, the way he had managed to get her this far. He treated the boy like a man. She's likely stuck somewhere safe, Elias said. The buildings where people work usually have their own power. She's probably sitting in a warm room right now, crying because she can't get to you. She's fighting to get back, kid. You have to believe that. I do. As the night wore on, the conversation slowed. Elias started to tell them stories to keep their minds off the cold. He talked about when the theater was open, how thousands of people would dress up in fancy clothes just to watch a movie or a play. He described the smell of the popcorn and the way the lights would dim until the room was perfectly dark. Lily listened with wide eyes. For a moment, she wasn't a freezing child in a snowstorm. She was a princess in a velvet seat, watching magic happen on a screen. But then, the unexpected happened. From the darkness of the street, they heard a new sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a mechanical whine, distant but getting louder. Then, a flash of blue and red light reflected off the falling snow. The blue house. Lily cheered, trying to stand up. Toby, look. The lights! Toby stood up, waving his arms wildly. Over here? We're over here. The vehicle was a heavy-duty police truck, the kind with massive tires meant for rescue missions. It was moving slowly, its searchlight cutting through the white haze. It was barely half a block away. Toby was sure they would see the fire, but the truck didn't turn. It kept going straight, the driver's vision likely obscured by the sheets of ice on the windshield. The lights began to fade as the truck moved further down the main road. "Wait!" Toby screamed, stepping out into the wind. He tried to run, but his legs were stiff, and the snow was too deep. He fell forward, his face hitting the freezing powder. Elias was up in an instant. He grabbed Toby by the jacket and hauled him back into the alcove. "Stop. You'll freeze out there in seconds." "They didn't see us." Toby sobbed, the first real tears of the night escaping. "They were right there, and they didn't see us." Elias looked at the fading red taillights of the truck. He looked at the dying fire and the two children. He knew that if they stayed here, they might last the night, but they might not be found for days. The snow would bury this alcove, and they would become just another part of the landscape. He looked at his own hands. They were shaking. He was an old man, and his heart wasn't what it used to be. He had spent years trying to stay invisible, trying to avoid the authorities and the system. But he looked at Toby's broken expression in Lily's trembling lip. "I have a flare," Elias said suddenly. "In my pack? I found it in an old boat in the shipyard years ago. I don't know if it still works. It's supposed to be waterproof." He dug through a tattered canvas bag, pulling out a plastic tube. It was faded and scratched. "If I light this here, the roof of the alcove will hide the light," Elias explained. "I have to go out there. I have to get to the middle of the intersection where the truck went. If I can get it to light, they'll see it for miles." "But the wind?" Toby said, looking at the man. "You'll get lost," Leah smiled. And for the first time, he looked truly peaceful. "I know these streets better than the people who built them, kid. I don't need my eyes to find the corner." He handed his heavy wool blanket to Toby. "Wrap this around both of you. Don't let the fire go out. Feed it the rest of the chair legs slowly. I'll be back with the people from the blue house." Elias stepped out into the white. He didn't look back. Toby watched as the old man's figure was swallowed by the storm. Then, too, suddenly the world turned a brilliant, screaming shade of crimson. A bright red light erupted from the center of the street, casting long, sharp shadows against the buildings. The flare was working. It hissed and sputtered, a defiant spark of fire in the middle of a frozen ocean. Toby watched from the alcove. his heart in his throat. In the red glow, he saw the silhouette of Elias, holding the flare high above his head like a torch. The old man looked like a giant. Then he saw the lights of the police truck return. The vehicle turned, its tires churning through the drifts. Heading straight for the red light, Toby hugged Lily so tight she gasped. "We're going home, Lil. We're going home." But as the truck reached the center of the intersection, the red light suddenly dropped. It fell into the snow and flickered out. The silhouette of the old man was gone. The police truck moved like a heavy armored beast through the deep drifts. Its headlights were like two angry eyes cutting through the swirling white chaos. Inside the alcove of the theater, Toby stood frozen, his hands gripped tightly into fists. He had seen the red light of the flare fall. He had seen the shadow of the old man vanish into the white void of the intersection. It was a silence that felt like a held breath. "Toby, why did the red light go away?" Lily asked. She was shivering again, the brief moment of hope having drained out of her as quickly as the light. "It's okay," Toby whispered, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. They saw it. They had to see it. The truck slowed to a crawl as it reached the spot where the flare had burned. The driver's side door opened and a figure stepped out, immediately disappearing up to their waist in snow. A powerful searchlight atop the truck began to swivel, scanning the street. It brushed past the abandoned cars, the buried fire hydrants, and finally, it hit the stone pillars of the theater. Toby didn't wait. He stepped out from the shelter, the wind instantly trying to knock him backward. He waved his arms, his mouth opening in a silent scream against the roar of the blizzard. "Here. We're here." The searchlight paused, flickered back, and then locked onto him. The light was so bright it turned the world into a painful white blur. Toby squinted, shielding his eyes, and he saw two figures in heavy neon jackets struggling through the drifts toward them. "Don't move." One of the voices boomed through a megaphone. Within seconds, the rescuers reached the alcove. They were covered in ice, their goggles fogged over, looking like explorers from another planet. The first officer, a tall man with a kind but stressed face, dropped to his knees in front of Toby. "Are you okay? Is there anyone else?" Toby pointed inside. "My sister. She's cold." "She's really cold," the officer's partner, a woman with quick, efficient movements, pushed past them and went straight to Lily. She checked the little girl's pulse, wrapped her in a thick, metallic emergency blanket, and tucked her under her own coat. "We've got her. She's okay. We've got her." Toby grabbed the first officer's sleeve, his fingers numb but strong. The man with the light. He was out there. He saved us. The officer looked back toward the intersection. The searchlight from the truck was already scanning the area where the flare had been. "We saw the light, kid. That's why we turned around." "Where is he?" "He fell," Toby said, his voice breaking. "He went out to show you where we were." "He's in the snow." The officers shared a quick, grave look. The woman picked Lily up, cradling her like a bundle of precious cargo. "Get the boy to the truck. I'll get her into the heater. Then we call for backup to sweep the intersection." The walk to the truck felt like an eternity. The wind was trying to tear Toby away from the officer's grip. Every step was a battle. When they finally reached the heavy door, the warmth that hit Toby's face was almost painful. It was too much, too fast. He was bundled into the back seat next to Lily, who was already being given a warm drink from a thermos, as the officers climbed into the front. The radio began to crackle with frantic voices. "Dispatch. This is Rescue Unit 4. We have located the two children reported missing from the 4th Street apartment. They are stable, but suffering from stage 1 hypothermia. Proceeding to the triage center at the hospital." There was a pause, a burst of static, and then a voice that made Toby's soul leap. It was a woman's voice, tired, sobbing, and desperate. "Is that them? Are they okay? Please, are my babies okay? Mama?" Lily cried out, reaching for the radio. "They're safe, ma'am," the officer said into the handset, his voice softening. "We're bringing them in now." Toby should have been happy. He should have been celebrating. But he kept looking out the frosted back window. The searchlight was still scanning the snow. He saw the spot where the flare had been. There was nothing but a smooth, white blanket of snow. The man who had called himself Mr. Winter, was nowhere to be seen. "Wait," Toby shouted, banging on the glass. "You have to find him. He's out there." "The backup teams are on their way, son," the officer said, looking at Toby through the rearview mirror. "They have thermal cameras and dogs. If he's out there, they'll find him. We have to get you and your sister to a doctor first. That's our job." The truck began to pick up speed, its massive chains clanking against the hidden ice on the road. Toby watched the theater fade into the white haze. He felt a deep, hollow ache in his chest. He thought about the theater chairs Elias had broken to keep them warm. He thought about the candy that tasted like peppermint and dust. He thought about how Elias had known he would get lost, but went out anyway. Back at the emergency center, the world became a blur of activity. There were bright lights, the smell of antiseptic, and the sound of many voices. Doctors wrapped them in warm forced air blankets. They gave them sweet, warm liquids. And then the door burst open. Their mother didn't walk in. She collapsed in. She had walked miles through the storm when the buses stopped. When she saw them, she made a sound that Toby would never forget, a mix of a sob and a laugh. She threw her arms around both of them, her tears hot against Toby's cold cheek. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," she kept whispering, kissing their hair, their foreheads, their hands. "I tried to get home. I tried so hard." "I know, Mama," Toby said, holding her tight. "I know." As the hours passed and the sun began to rise, the storm finally started to break. The wind died down to a whisper, and the sky turned a pale, icy blue. The news was already starting to spread. A reporter at the hospital had heard the story of the flare in the blizzard. A photo had been taken by one of the officers, a grainy, dark image of Toby and Lily, huddled in the back of the truck, their faces lit by the dashboard lights. But the real story was the mystery of the man who had saved them. A nurse came into the room with a small television. She turned on the local news. The headline across the bottom of the screen read, "Search continues for the guardian of the storm." The reporter was standing near the theater. The snow had been cleared a bit, and a team of rescuers was digging near the intersection. Charred circle in the snow. Toby watched the screen, his breath hitching. He saw an officer walk over to a mound of snow about 50 yards from where the flare had been. The officer stopped, signaled to the others, and began to dig carefully with his hands. The camera zoomed in. They pulled something out of the snow. It wasn't a person. It was a heavy, tattered wool coat, the one Elias had given to Toby to wrap himself and Lily in. Beside it lay the empty plastic tube of the flare. But there was no body, no footprints leading away. Just the coat and the flare. "He's gone," Toby whispered. "Baby?" his mother asked, stroking his hair. "The man," Toby said. "He gave us everything he had. He gave us his fire and his coat and his light." The news anchor's voice became solemn. "Witnesses say the man who led rescuers to the children was a local member of the homeless community, known only as Elias, while his whereabouts remain unknown. His actions have sparked a wave of support across the city. Millions are calling for better shelters and care for those left out in the cold." Toby looked out the hospital window. The sun was finally hitting the snow, making the whole world sparkle like it was covered in diamonds. They would call it a miracle. They would call Elias a hero. But Toby knew the truth was simpler than that. Elias wasn't a ghost or a legend. He was just a man who had been cold for a very long time, and he didn't want two children to feel the same way. Toby looked at Lily, who was fast asleep in their mother's arms, her cheeks finally pink and warm. He looked at his own hands, which were no longer shaking. He made a silent promise to the empty air. To the man who might be gone, or might just be hiding in another shadow. "I won't forget," Toby thought. "I'll tell everyone what you did." The story was far from over. The city was waking up, and the world was about to learn that sometimes the warmest hearts are found in the coldest places. The days following the great storm were different from any other days the city had ever known. Usually after a big snow, people just shoveled their walks, complained about the traffic, and went back to their own lives. But this time, something had shifted. The story of Toby, Lily, and the man who called himself Elias had traveled faster than the wind. It was on every television screen, every social media feed, and every dinner table conversation. People were calling it the miracle of the marquee. Toby sat in the living room of their new apartment. The city housing department, moved by the public outcry, had found them a place with thick walls and a heater that hummed with a steady, comforting rhythm. His mother didn't have to work the night shift anymore. A local business had offered her a job in an office with better pay and weekends off. Everything was supposed to be perfect, but Toby often found himself sitting by the window. Looking out at the street below, he was looking for a tattered coat. He was looking for a man with a beard matted with frost. Lily was on the floor, coloring a picture of a giant orange sun. She seemed to have recovered the fastest, her childhood resilience shielding her from the deeper shadows of that night. To her, Elias was a kind of winter spirit. But Toby remembered the weight of Elias's hand on his shoulder. He remembered the smell of the wood smoke. He knew Elias was a man of flesh and bone. And he knew that a man without a coat in a blizzard didn't just walk away. One afternoon, a knock came at the door. It was a woman named Clara, a social worker who had been helping the family settle in. She held a small, weathered leather book in her hands. "The police found this," she said softly, handing it to Toby's mother. It was tucked inside the lining of that old coat they recovered near the theater. "They thought you might want to see it." Toby crowded close as his mother opened the book. It wasn't a diary exactly. It was a book of sketches and names. There were drawings of the theater in its prime with people in top hats and long dresses. There were sketches of the city park in the summer. And on the very last page, there was a fresh drawing, done in charcoal. It showed two small children huddled together, a tall boy protecting a smaller girl. Underneath it, in shaky but elegant handwriting, were the words, "The bravest explorers I ever met." "He was an artist," Toby's mother whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "He was more than that," Clara said. "We did some digging. Elias used to be a teacher. He lost his home years ago after his wife passed away, and he got sick. He stayed on the streets because he said he wanted to be close to the theater where they had their first date." The unexpected ending that moved millions didn't happen in a hospital or a courtroom. It happened on the 1-month anniversary of the storm. The city had decided to tear down the old boarded-up theater to build a parking lot. But when the day came for the demolition, something happened. Toby, Lily, and their mother arrived at the theater to find a crowd. Not a crowd of protesters, but a crowd of people carrying blankets, coats, and heaters. There were thousands of them. They stood in front of the theater doors, blocking the path of the bulldozers. A man stepped forward, a wealthy businessman who had seen Toby's photo on the news. He announced that he had bought the theater. He wasn't going to tear it down. Instead, he was going to turn it into Elias' house. It would be a place where anyone caught in the cold could find a bed, a hot meal, and a warm coat. The theater's grand lobby would become a community center, and the stage would be used to teach art and music to children who had nowhere else to go. The crowd cheered. But Toby's eyes were fixed on the theater's marquee. Workers were up on ladders, changing the letters. They weren't putting up the name of a movie. They were putting up a quote from Elias's book, "No one is a stranger when you share the light," as the sun began to set. The marquee lights flickered to life. For the first time in decades, the theater glowed with a warm amber light. The crowd began to quiet down, taking in the beauty of the old building brought back to life. Toby felt a tug on his sleeve. It was Lily. She was pointing toward the back of the crowd near the edge of the park. "Toby, look. It's him." Toby's heart skipped a beat. He looked where she was pointing. In the shadows of the trees, he saw a figure. The man was wearing a new, sturdy blue coat, the kind the Elias house had been handing out all morning. He had a clean beard and a hat pulled low over his eyes. For a brief second, the man looked toward the children and gave a small, almost invisible nod. Then He turned and walked into the park, disappearing into the evening mist. Toby didn't run after him. He didn't shout. He understood. Elias didn't want the fame or the cameras. He didn't want to be a monument. It was about a change in the heart of a city. The unexpected ending was that the two children who were left alone in the cold ended up bringing the whole world in from the chill. Toby took his mother's hand and his sister's hand, and together, they walked toward the glowing lights of the theater. Leaving the darkness behind them for good, the cold would come again. Always did, but from that night on, the city knew how to keep each other warm.